Hello and good morning. Welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. I am Kelly Vlahos and I am the editor-in-chief at Responsible Statecraft. And before I go further, I just would implore you to subscribe, hit the like buttons, particularly if you're on YouTube right now. We're really trying to engage and broaden our audience. We're also on Substack and Spotify. So please give us some likes and subscribe and keep returning. We have some great guests, and that includes a fantastic guest today, my friend Gareth Porter. I have the pleasure of introducing him. He's a legendary journalist, historian, and policy analyst who Seymour Hersh once called a one-man truth squad, exposing the American government and its acolytes in the mainstream press corps. Gareth began his career reporting during the Vietnam War and has, over the decades, written a number of books and as well as numerous articles for many publications. His books include Perils of Dominance, Imbalance of Power, and the Road to War in Vietnam, the CIA's Insider Guide to the Iran Crisis with John Kirikou, and Manufactured Crisis, the Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare, which we are going to be talking about today. Welcome, Gareth.
Thanks so much, Kel. Good to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. Gareth's integrity, his consistency and skepticism of power, his deeply probing approach to the story, especially in places where the mainstream has feared to tread, has become his trademark, and we are lucky to have him here today. We're going to talk about his book, but also this ongoing disastrous war we're in the Middle East. Gareth, I want to talk to you about the book, but let's first check in with President Trump on the issue of the war and Iran's nuclear program. Chris, and I wanted to introduce my producer, Chris, because he has been so kind to pull a lot of this stuff together in the back end for me and is very patient with me. Thank you, Chris, my producer, Chris Leonard. Chris, let's go to cut one.
I had to stop a country, very powerful, very dangerous country, from having a nuclear weapon because they'd use it. They'd blow up the world. They'd blow up the Middle East. They'd blow up Israel. They'd come here. They'd blow up Europe. They're nuts, okay? They're crazy people. I deal with them. And very high-strung people, really crazy. And get along with them. I like them. But you don't want to let them have a nuclear weapon. And I'm doing the world a service, but I'm doing our country a service. It's America first. I'm doing our country a service.
Gareth, you wrote this book, Manufactured Crisis, 12 years ago to challenge Washington's decades-long orthodoxy, alleging that Iran had an active nuclear weapons program. In meticulous detail, you suggest that the U.S. and Israel carefully crafted what you call a nuclear scare to maintain this policy of aggression and isolation against Iran all the way since the 1990s. Are you saying in your book that Iran never had a real weapons program and that we are in a war right now based on lies, misinformation, propaganda, fear, and ideological politics?
Well, you said it better than I could have, Kel, in one sentence. The book was really a discovery on my part once I started the research as to just how horribly the U.S. system of government and media has completely muffed the whole question of Iran and its nuclear program. Just to begin with, the point that I like to make is that it has now been 33 years since the U.S. government began to accuse Iran of having a nuclear weapons program, a covert nuclear weapons program. And during those 33 years, of course, they have never produced one iota of evidence to support that. To the contrary, everything that has happened during those decades has shown repeatedly that Iran did not have any nuclear weapons program. In fact, from the beginning, the whole point for the Iranians was that they were going to use nuclear power for energy. And my book explains, I won't go into detail, but it explains that in the 1980s, the Iranians originally didn't think that they wanted to have nuclear power at all, and then they had a terrible winter in which their heating system did not work properly, and people were too cold. And so that was the initial decision to decide that they should have nuclear power in order to provide heat during the winter. And that was the beginning of this entire yarn. The problem that arose very quickly was that there was a bureaucratic interest on the part of people in the U.S. government at that point in accusing Iran of having nuclear weapons, partly because at the end of the Cold War, the U.S. military, the CIA, needed to have a substitute for the Soviet Union. And they looked around the world, and the best thing that they could come up with was the threat of nuclear weapons from third world countries. And of course, Iran was the primary suspect in that regard. They had already had a problem. I should not say a problem, but they had already had an antagonism toward Iran during the Iran-Iraq War because they were supporting the Iraqis against Iran. Although they were also playing both sides a little bit. I won't go into the detail about that. But anyway, they very, very easily picked Iran as the fall guy for their trip with regard to nuclear weapons. And that brings us to, I want to quickly get to the key point here, which is that the Israelis, of course, were behind the real turning point in the whole yarn, because in 2003, they made a decision they were going to pin the nuclear weapons charge on Iran once and for all, and they created this set of documents which showed up in a briefcase. The German government first got it from the Mujahideen Calc, and they turned it over to the United States, and those documents then became the evidence that became unshakable, and it was the reason why the U.S. government never changed its mind that the Iranians had a nuclear weapons program, and nothing could change the minds of those people in the U.S. government about the issue. But what I found out, and this is really the biggest story that I ever broke in my life, was that those documents were created by the Israelis. I found out the whole story from the German government official who was the liaison with the U.S. government in regard to all national security issues. And he had actually written an article in the Wall Street Journal that nobody paid any attention to, that more or less said openly that this whole idea that Iran had nuclear weapons was an Israeli fix that was deliberately planted. I called him and I got an interview with him, and he revealed the whole story to me, that the German government had gotten these documents, they examined them, and they realized that they couldn't possibly be real, that they were fake. They had passed them on to the United States government, but they warned the CIA at the time not to take them seriously, not to take them at face value. And obviously, we know that that's not what happened. The CIA, as part of the administration, basically went along with this whole fraud that these documents were real and that it showed that the Iranians had a secret nuclear weapons program. So that, in a nutshell, was the story that I broke. I believe it was 2008 when the story came out. So that's really the crux of the matter. Ever since then, the U.S. public as well as U.S. government has been convinced that, of course, the Iranians had nuclear weapons. There's no question about that. And by the way, I tried to take this story, I tried to interest the Los Angeles Times and the Wall Street Journal in doing a story, not my story, but their own story based on the facts of the matter that they could ascertain for themselves if they contacted this German source. Neither one of them was interested. They wouldn't touch it. And that is part of the story, I think, of what's wrong with the system in terms of the whole policy toward Iran.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I I have to say, I want to go back just a bit because, and I want to show that I have your book here and see all tabs because I interviewed you at the time when this book came out. Um, I'm fascinated by the politics and the history. I mean, you gave us a broad sweep through the 90s and through the Bush administration. Um, I was I was pretty surprised because I was rereading the book in anticipation of our conversation that Robert Gates was sort of at the beginning here. He was acting CIA director under H.W. Bush. He comes into the picture. He's smarting from the Iran Contra affair. He's passed over for jobs because of his connection to it during the Reagan administration. He comes under the influence of Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz. Gates himself, as you said, is looking for the next bugaboo now that the Iron Curtain is down. Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz are pushing this Israel defense imperative in the Middle East, and they become sort of the primordial ooze. But it really sounds like it was the Clinton administration that really breathed life into this narrative that Iran was a nuclear threat, it was a global terrorist threat, and along with the Israelis, set the course for the policy over the next 30 years. As you point out, the evidence was really thin, but it really ramped up under folks like Martin Indyk. Could you talk a little bit about the role that the Clinton administration played and why they were open to shifting the policy, at least in the beginning, against Iran in this way?
Sure. I mean, this is a big part of the whole story that the Clinton administration, it began really before the administration came into office when Clinton chose this guy who was somebody who worked for the Israeli government as an advisor on media, but who was really selling himself to Clinton as an expert on the Middle East, and he convinced Clinton about the whole issue of Iran as a threat with nuclear weapons, and so Clinton grabbed onto this and basically started the ball rolling in terms of accusing Iran, excuse me, accusing Iran of having a nuclear weapons program. And it was all basically a political ploy because he was he cozied up to the Israelis. And this was part of the process of having a joint policy with the Israelis against Iran. So that was the centerpiece of the policy during the Clinton administration. And it really set up a situation where the Israelis began to think about a bigger fish to fry, which is what I was just talking about a few minutes ago.
Oh yeah, the bigger fish to fry, and that combined with the growing influence of the Israeli lobby in Washington didn't hurt either, as you point out in the book. Um, Gareth, we we joke that Netanyahu is always saying that Iran is just weeks, months, or a few short weeks or years from getting the bomb. But as you point out in the book, this was one of the ways that Israel could get the U.S. to increase the pressure on Iran, and have been providing this quote unquote intelligence for 35 years in that regard. We have a little bit of a mashup on that, brought to you by Chris. Can we take a look at cut two?
Iran has never given up its quest for nuclear weapons, and the missiles to deliver them.
Nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons. Atomic bombs.
Within 3 to 5 years, we can assume that Iran will become autonomous in its ability to develop and produce a nuclear bomb.
The two nations that are vying, competing with each other, who will be the first to achieve nuclear weapons, is Iraq and Iran. At most, by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage. From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb.
And if not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months, less than a year.
Iran lied.
But for Netanyahu,
Big time.
the slogan has been the same for decades.
Well done. That was great. That's the best I've seen.
I love watching Netanyahu age over the course of 35 years
Right,
there.
right.
It's
No,
unbelievable.
It's well done because it does show, very briefly just how long this show has been going on, that Netanyahu personally has been responsible for so long. And in the process, I mean, they really did dirty tricks. I mean, that's the only thing you can call it. I mentioned already the fact that they pulled off this business of the documents, but that was only the beginning of decades long set of tricks by the Netanyahu government, and one of them that was very important is that they claimed later on that they had actually discovered and took away an entire set of documents, secret Iranian documents that showed how they had carried out this secret nuclear weapons program for decades. And this, I've written about this more than once. They have never allowed anyone to really look into the documents deeply. It's only a very short, very quick glance that outsiders have been allowed, very carefully chosen outsiders, I should say, have been allowed to look at. And the whole thing reeks of a complete scam from beginning to end.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I want to go back a second just to this period of the Clinton administration into the Bush administration. It seems to me, as we're talking about Netanyahu's many warnings, that sometimes the evidence, the documents, the warnings come when U.S. policy seems to be heading towards more of a rapprochement with Iran. There were little tiny periods of this, and I think you identify one during the Clinton administration later on in the second term. And that seems to be when these things are pulled out of the hat. What is it about Iran? And I know that Trita Parsi, my boss at the Quincy Institute, has talked about this many times, that this nuclear scare was deliberately keeping the United States from getting any closer with Iran and isolating Iran from the rest of the region, that it was the intention of Israel all along to make sure that they were isolated from their Arab neighbors. Can you talk a little bit about the nuclear scare maybe being used as a cover for other policies and all other interests, whether it be the national security state here, but also in Israel?
Well, absolutely, you're correct in the broad sweep of history here that it has had this theme over and over again. The most important one of all, of course, was the one during the administration of George Bush and George W. Bush, and that was the one in which the Bush administration was basically carrying out a preparation for an attack on Iran. And they were carrying out this very elaborate game of portraying Iran as a nuclear threat. And so they went through, a very elaborate, uh, basically it was a, a, a certain kind of game that they played that made Iran look like it was definitely a threat to use make nuclear weapons and to use them. But it was clearly something that was being done to prepare for an attack on Iran. The George W. Bush administration was going to use this as a basis for an attack on Iran. That was the ultimate goal of it. And so it was the worst of all the cases that you've alluded to, where the U.S. government has made accusations about nuclear weapons program in Iran that was basically used simply to set up something the United States itself wanted to do.
What about regime change? Because you also have a chapter after the Clinton administration moving into to George W. Bush that tackles the issue of when there was almost a deliberate shift from not a shift away from the nuclear scare, but I guess you would call an evolution into a regime change goal, which was driven by the ascendant neoconservatives at the time in that administration, including Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, Dick Cheney, Scooter Libby, and others who may or may not have been using the scares, whether it be terrorism and nuclear weapons, to push this idea that it was the regime that ultimately had to go. And I think that sets us on the course of what we are seeing today.
Well, you're absolutely right. This was the high point historically of the degree to which the U.S. government tried to portray Iran as not just a threat to carry out policies that were they didn't like, but a regime that had to be removed. And that really was their intention during the George W. Bush administration. And it was, of course, totally unrealistic. They had no realistic plan as to how they were going to do it. And it was a measure of just how completely unrealistic these policymakers were. They were extremely ideological in their orientation, far more than realistic in terms of an understanding of the politics of the region. And ultimately, they were unable to carry it off for a variety of reasons, which we don't have time to get into. But it was a measure of just how far out of reality these people were in their policymaking.
Yeah, and at some point, and I can't remember who you ascribed this to, and I don't want to go filching through the book now, that you say that Iran and Iraq were identified as the two mortal threats to both Israel and the United States in terms of, its interests in the region. And so after 9/11, I get it. I guess they got their way with Iraq. They saw that was more feasible to execute the regime change there and leave Iran, for the time being.
Yeah, this was a period of extreme sort of ambition on the part of the U.S. government, which was, as you've suggested, extremely unrealistic. These people really had no concept of what they were dealing with. It was just a measure of how little they understood the international politics of the region, and particularly how they understood Iran itself. They did not have any real deep understanding of the background, the history of Iran. And one of the points that you made in introducing this show is that they accused Iran of being aggressive and so forth. And this was merely because they had to have some basis for regime change, which is really what the Bush administration was all about. And they were totally incapable of bringing that about. It was a measure of just how little they understood the Iranian regime and really how little understanding they had of regional politics as well.
Oh, absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about the Obama administration? Because that's the period where there was a concerted effort to work with the Iranians to put restrictions or limits on its nuclear program. There was a lot of hard work done. You were very active in writing about it at the time. Your book came out just before the JCPOA, the nuclear deal was made with the United States and several of its European partners with Iran. Why did, why wasn't Obama sucked into the same vortex as the two previous presidents when it came to Israel and the nuclear scare? They seem to have broken out, at least to the point where they got this deal, which was very hated by Netanyahu and the Israelis, as well as the Persian Gulf states at the time.
Oh, that's a very good question. And the answer is kind of subtle. I mean, I think Obama was an outsider who had not been part of the politics of anti-Iran, pro-Israeli policy over decades. And that's what gave him the relative freedom to decide on a policy that departed from his predecessors. And one should add, however, that he was not totally free of the taint of intervention in Iran. He did carry out a policy of covert operations against Iran, which involved basically sabotaging Iran's nuclear program, a very elaborate sabotage program, which took the Iranians some time to try to repair, but did not stop them ultimately. And what happened with Obama was that he, as you said, did decide that they should try to reach an agreement with Iran on a nuclear program. And that's why there was a very long and elaborate set of negotiations. I have a feeling this is the longest set of negotiations for an international agreement in history, in the U.S. diplomatic history. I was there at the final round of negotiations, which took, as I recall, 38 days. And I was convinced that that was a record in terms of international diplomacy for how long it took to negotiate an agreement. And it was a very interesting negotiation in that most of the problem was not the technical issues of how to arrange for the parts of the agreement that involved limiting the Iranian nuclear program. It was really about the international politics that surrounded it. That's what took the most time and involved the most negotiations. I think that was my impression after being there and seeing what was transpiring. Because the result was that there was an understanding between the United States and other European states, as well as Israel, about how there would be a program to control Iran after the agreement was reached. And that was really a matter that was very complex and was carried out over a period of years. This was a very unusual, to say the least, set of negotiations and an unusual result.
Yeah, and it didn't take much time for Trump to unravel all of it once he got in office in 2017, which was very unfortunate because from all accounts, they were keeping to the agreement. I know that the neocons and the Republicans in Washington want to say they weren't following the agreement. They weren't letting inspectors in. But from what I remember, the IAEA, as well as the United Nations, has said they were keeping to the agreement, particularly the enrichment limitations on their part. But we know that the Trump administration had a number of neocons in his administration, including Nikki Haley, who he made UN ambassador, who was seemingly on the forefront of his anti-Iran policy and had been banging the drum against this deal at the minute she got into office. And he said, I'm going to get a better deal. This was a rotten deal. Obama gave them all this money that they shouldn't have had and made things worse. And he ripped it up in, what was it, 2018? 2020? Now I forget. Sorry, listeners. But he ripped it up.
So this was really a matter of the Israelis pressing the administration. He was not the one who was making the decisions here. The Israelis were insisting that Trump carry out this very elaborate policy of pressure on Iran to get them to renegotiate, essentially. It was not his idea; it was the Israeli idea, because they wanted more. Basically, that's what this was all about. They wanted a better deal, which would limit Iran much more, and basically, shut down. The Iranian nuclear program. That's what they were after. So it's a good example of just how Trump was beholden to the Israelis for his foreign policy, and particularly with regard to Iran.
Yeah, from the very beginning, and it was 2018, which makes more sense because it was clearly within a year of him getting into office, and it didn't take long for the Iranians to say, okay, well, because when he shut it down, the sanctions came back down, from what I remember.
Right.
And they waited a little while, and then they started ramping up their enrichment, for which the Republicans say, see, they can't be trusted. And that started the spiral that we're in right now, because the Biden administration really had no guts and engaged in talks the entire 4 years of Biden's presidency. But they went nowhere because Biden was afraid of being seen as weak. And as you mentioned, the politics were incredible during the Obama administration to get this thing passed. The Republicans tried tooth and nail to keep it from happening. And I think Biden was afraid of crossing the Republicans, being seen as weak, not being tough on Iran and the terrible regime, and never pulled the trigger on a new deal. Then Trump comes back into office, and the Israelis aren't happy enough with just not having a deal. They want to go to war.
Well, you're right about this chronology. I would just add, however, that it was the Israelis who were insisting, of course, that Biden carry out this policy.
Yeah.
Your viewers should know that Biden is the one U.S. president who has openly declared that he's a Zionist.
Yep.
Not very many people understand this, and indeed, I don't want to go into it, but when I wrote the story, a story pointing this out, it was actually not published. It's the only time in my life that I have been not allowed to publish a story. But the fact that I quoted Biden himself admitting that he was a Zionist, it was not allowed to be published. And that was unfortunate, to say the least.
Well, and you were also ahead of your time, because you could have published it today, which says a lot about our current moment, that it is much more open to criticism, Israel is, than it was when you wrote that piece or when Biden was in office and any of the previous years. We've gotten to a point where we can talk about these things.
Well, you're right about that.
Openly.
Absolutely. This is like a revolutionary change that's taking place, or that has taken place.
Yeah.
It's very important indeed. Yeah.
So my last question, Trump is not a neocon in the classic sense, but he seems to have been the gift that keeps on giving to all of the forces in both the U.S. national security state and the Israeli government, who have wanted this direct confrontation with Iran for years. Iran has long avoided this confrontation, but seems to be in a better position now that it's happened. It looks like your book, was quite prescient. The policy was based on such distortion because there was no evidence, because they had to conflate and confabulate all of Iran's threat to the globe. Now they're in a war and can't seem to get out of this mess. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how you feel watching, this evolution from Bob Gates period, where it was sort of a kernel of like, okay, now we got this new bugaboo on the stage, all the way to a president who literally did Israel's bidding and went to war and now can't seem to get out of it.
Well, let me just point out one thing that is precisely related to the point that you just made, and that is that in this book about the Iran crisis that I did with my friend John Kiriakou, we actually have a part in here that points out precisely what you're saying, that it was Iran that I'm reading from it now. A war with Iran would result from a U.S. Retaliation for a military attack, but from, sorry, I need more light here. But from the Iranian response, not from that, but from Iranian response to the provocation inherent in the Trump administration's assault on the Iranian economy. And so this, we point out here that it was anticipated that there would be an Iranian closure of the Strait of Hormuz in response to the next such problem that arose. So it was very clear that the Iranians understood the Strait of Hormuz was their hole card, and they had anticipated this years ago. And that's why we have the situation now that the world economy is facing. They understood it before. I mean, it was perfectly clear that that's what was going to happen if another crisis arose over Iran's nuclear program.
And it seems too that the regime change, approach, instinct, all fell apart too, because as you point out in your book, the neocons were obviously pushing for it. They felt like it would be successful because there were people in Iran who were oppressed by the regime, that they were ready to rise up, take over once U.S. or Israel took out the leadership. Well, that happened, at least the taking out of the leadership part. But there has been no rising up. And in fact, the leaders who have replaced the murdered leadership are more hardline and will be more oppressive and repressive to the people who are there than the previous one. So, I mean, that too fell apart. It was built on a house of cards.
You're absolutely right. And this is a key point about Iran, which I'm afraid that the U.S. media has not really fully understood, but is totally, it's the primary reality that we face that has to be taken into account in any discussion of U.S. policy, because the vast majority of Iranians are very supportive of the position of the Iranian government towards nuclear weapons, the anti-nuclear weapons stance, and very supportive of their policy toward Israel and the United States. And this has been true for decades now, and it's extremely well documented by U.S.-based studies of public opinion in Iran over the years.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Gareth, and thank you. And I just want to remind viewers, Manufactured Crisis is the book. I mean, if you really want the history of the nuclear scare, this is where you start. And Gareth's other books as well. Thank you to everyone listening today. If you like this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. And Gareth, I hope to see you again on the show. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Cal. Good to be on the show with you.